Most people today do not have a clear answer to a simple question. Who is the Qur'an actually from? For nearly 2 billion Muslims, the answer is clear. It is the word of God, revealed to Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. But most of the world's population does not regard it as true, which logically leaves only two possibilities. Either Muhammad was truthful about the Qur'an's origin, or he was not. Answering this single question clarifies every explanation that follows. For non-Muslims, the Qur'an is something else, not revelation, but explanation. A copy of earlier scriptures, a cultural product of its time, or the result of extraordinary human ability. And if we put all of these explanations on the table, one key question remains: is there a single human theory that can completely explain the origin of the Qur'an from beginning to end? Because the Qur'an is not just a collection of stories about prophets that partially overlap with earlier revelations. It contains a legal framework, a moral system, social reforms, and a coherent vision of humanity and the world. And a textual structure that went beyond everything the Arabic language had known at the time. And, importantly for this investigation, even many serious non-Muslim scholars, while not accepting it as divine, acknowledge that the Qur'an is not a trivial text, but rather a book that has had a deep and lasting impact on law, culture, philosophy, and language. So, behind all these explanations lies a deeper question that is rarely asked out loud. If the Qur'an is not from God, then who is it from? And how did it come into existence at all? Let us assume, purely hypothetically, that the Qur'an is not divine revelation. In that case, this is no longer a religious debate. It becomes an investigative problem. How could one man produce a text of this magnitude under the circumstances in which he lived? If Muhammad wrote the Qur'an himself, how did he acquire the knowledge, structure, and long-term consistency of a text that emerged over more than 20 years? Especially in a society with limited literacy and limited access to sources. If he copied from others, what exactly did he copy? From whom, where, and under what conditions did he even have access to those sources? If the Qur'an partially overlaps with earlier revelations, how do we explain the parts that differ significantly, and those that have no parallel in earlier texts at all? If all of this was driven by personal ambition, what were his real motives? What could he realistically gain? And does that align with what he actually gained during his lifetime? Are we talking about poetic talent, exceptional intelligence, psychological delusion or obsession, or a calculated long-term deception? These questions will not be answered selectively. Every explanation is examined under the same framework and the same standard. If a theory claims to explain the origin of the Qur'an, it must be able to address all of these questions together. In this video, artificial intelligence, AI, is used as an analytical tool, not to decide what is true, but to test whether each explanation is internally consistent. The criteria and full structure of this analysis will be shown throughout the video. But one thing will be tracked from start to finish. Not how convincing an explanation sounds on its own, but what happens to it when it is placed alongside the others. Some limitations only appear when all explanations are viewed together. So we begin step by step with the simplest and most frequently repeated claim: that Muhammad was simply a poet and a gifted speaker. When Muhammad began reciting what we now call the Qur'an, the people around him did not have a category called global revelation. They had poets. In pre-Islamic Arabia, a poet was a combination of influencer, public voice, and political commentator. His verses could elevate a tribe or humiliate it. So the first label many applied was simple. He is a poet. At first glance, this seems reasonable. The Quran is in Arabic. It is recited. It has rhythm that is easy to memorize. People weep when they hear it. If you only look at that surface layer, the conclusion he was a poet does not sound implausible. But once the AI analysis moves deeper, the first serious problem appears. Classical Arabic poetry follows strict meters and patterns. Verses have predictable rhythm and rhyme. You can often anticipate the next beat. The Quran has rhythm, but it does not follow established poetic forms. It shifts sentence length and moves abruptly from description to command, from narrative to direct address. This no longer functions as classical poetry. Poets typically build their work around themselves, their tribe, and their emotions. The Quran consistently removes focus from Muhammad. It does not say, "I say." It repeatedly says, "Say." That does not align with an author seeking admiration for his own voice or style. Poets speak of love, war, honor, nostalgia, and personal wisdom. The Quran introduces something fundamentally different. Rules of inheritance, trade and debt, family law, care for the poor and vulnerable, and the inner dialogue of the human being, fear, guilt, and hope. This moves beyond literary expression into a normative and regulatory framework. If we want to test whether someone was just a poet, the logical step is to examine how contemporaries who knew the language perceived him. Early sources record that people struggled to classify the Quran, neither poetry nor any known speech form. Some called it magic, not because they understood it, but because they did not know where to place it. Labeling him a poet had a clear effect. It reduced the message to a human level. Yet their behavior toward him did not match how poets were typically treated. AI notes a key point here. The poetic label explains sound and impression, but not how the text behaves as a whole. In the end, the poetic theory explains why the Quran sounds powerful and is recited. But poetry does not assume responsibility for regulating law, ethics, and social obligations. The Quran does. As an explanation of origin, the poetic theory does not fully account for the nature of the text. But today there is a modern version of the same idea. Not that he was just a poet, but that he was an extraordinary genius. And that leads to the next test. When the label poet was no longer sufficient, a more serious version emerged. Not that Muhammad was an entertainer, but that he possessed an exceptional intellect. This is perhaps the most appealing modern theory for skeptics. It does not accuse him of lying. It avoids ridicule and conspiracy. It argues that the Quran is impressive, but does not require a divine source. Rare intelligence, charisma, and linguistic intuition are enough. At first glance, this sounds reasonable. If Muhammad was exceptionally intelligent, that could explain his influence and why people followed him. The real question in this AI analysis is not whether this is possible, but whether it explains the full scope of the text. Through one man comes a text that simultaneously addresses theology, law, ethics, family life, commerce, war and peace, personal spirituality, and collective psychology. This does not resemble narrow brilliance in one field, but engagement across many domains at once. Some may argue that this breadth is precisely what makes him exceptional. That remains a theoretical possibility. But AI highlights one crucial issue: stability. The Quran emerges in stages, under vastly different conditions, yet its core tone and message remain stable over more than 20 years. We do not see early uncertainty or later retraction of foundational claims. Human authors, even geniuses, usually leave traces of development, learning curves, influence, revision. When compared to known historical geniuses, those traces are typically visible. In Muhammad's case, based on available biographical sources, such traces are not clearly present. Genius can explain eloquence. It can explain charisma. It can explain influence. But it does not explain why the text behaves as a coherent and complete system from the outset. And so those who reject divine origin often move to the next explanation, the most sensitive test so far. When the genius theory fails to explain the whole, many skeptics turn to a subtler option. Perhaps Muhammad was not a manipulative genius. Perhaps he was not consciously constructing a system, but rather a man who sincerely believed that something transcendent was happening, while everything unfolded within his own psyche. At first glance, this appears compelling. No lies, no conspiracy, no hidden agenda. AI analysis shows that this theory explains certain psychological elements. It accounts for conviction, discipline, modest living, and why people follow someone who deeply believes in what he says. In psychology, sincere belief is often more persuasive than conscious deception. But this theory has a clear limit. If the message originates purely from an internal psychological state, that state should leave a recognizable pattern in the message itself. When compared with known psychological conditions throughout history, AI finds no clear parallel. Long-term psychological disturbances or delusions do not produce messages that are structurally stable, normatively consistent, and capable of sustaining a functional community over time. There are variations of this theory. Historical claims of possession, or medical hypotheses such as epilepsy or neurological conditions. They attempt to explain the experience, but leave the same question unresolved. How do such states produce coherent law, moral systems, and a stable message without internal breakdown? Thus, the psychological theory explains belief and motivation, but not the origin of the message itself. It may describe what the person experienced, but not how the message functions as a complete system. And here, the analysis moves into a different territory. If the source is not internal, the next logical assumption is that it came from outside. Perhaps Muhammad did not invent the Qur'an. Perhaps he learned it from others. This is one of the oldest and most frequently repeated explanations. Its most common form claims that the Quran was copied from earlier religious traditions. AI confirms thematic parallels with earlier prophets, Noah, Moses, and Jesus. But analysis cannot stop at shared narratives. It must examine structure, emphasis, and direction. AI finds no pattern of direct textual copying in the Quran. Instead, parallel narratives are systematically reshaped. There are no duplicated passages, no translation artifacts, and no mirrored narrative frameworks. Characters are portrayed differently. Moral emphasis shifts. The theological direction changes. If material was taken, it was not copied. It was reconstructed. This creates an additional problem. There is no clear historical evidence of a complete Arabic Bible being available in Mecca or Medina at that time. There is no record of Muhammad working with written biblical texts or possessing the linguistic mastery required for independent theological synthesis. This leads to a combined version of the theory, the idea of a secret teacher. This accusation existed even among his contemporaries, but remained vague. No name, no location, no time frame. Muhammad's life is among the best documented of its era. For a text developing over years into a complex system, a teacher would need to be continuously present and involved. Occasional encounters cannot explain sustained production. Overall, this theory requires increasingly invisible steps, while leaving too few concrete traces. Using comparative analysis, AI estimates that roughly 15% of the Quran shows thematic parallels with earlier revelations, while only about 5 to 7% share core narrative substance. This means the majority of the Quran has no clear prior model in earlier scriptures. Even granting all assumptions in favor of copying, the theory remains insufficient. How do we explain the remaining 85%? Is there any human explanation that accounts for the whole? Among modern skeptics, one theory is often considered the most reasonable. Not that Muhammad wrote the Quran, but that the community did after him. According to this view, the Quran emerged through collective editing, political decisions, and later agreements, all attributed retroactively to one man. It sounds modern, organized, reasonable. But for this to work, the community must pass 3 tests. First, motive. Why would multiple factions, often in conflict, invest enormous effort to produce a unified text attributed to a deceased figure? Second, mechanism. Such a project would require manuscripts, editors, institutional authority, and the power to suppress dissent. Third, and hardest, time. Historical sources, including non-Muslim ones, record that the Quran was recited and memorized during Muhammad's lifetime and spread among thousands. If the text was altered later, how did so many witnesses accept a version different from what they already knew? Collective projects usually leave traces, disputes, drafts, rejected versions, and protests. Here, such traces are largely absent. This does not make the theory impossible, but it requires assumptions more complex than the problem it attempts to solve. AI analysis finds no consistent mechanism that explains collective authorship without serious fractures. At this point, all major human explanations have been tested. If none can explain the origin without contradiction, the question is no longer theoretical. It becomes simple and decisive. Was Muhammad lying, or was he telling the truth? Could Muhammad have knowingly lied? If the Quran is not from God, this possibility must be examined. Here, AI does not assess belief, but behavioral patterns, comparing conscious deception with what historical sources reveal about Muhammad. Long-term deception typically involves clear motive, personal benefit, and message adjustment to reduce risk. In the early years of the message, pressure increases rather than benefit. Ridicule, boycott, exile, and prolonged conflict. In such conditions, deceivers usually compromise. Here, the message does not change. Sources record offers of wealth, status, and power, all refused. This weakens the deception hypothesis, as behavior does not follow normal risk-reward logic. AI also examines reputation before the message. There is no pattern of habitual lying. Even opponents resort to labels like poet or sorcerer rather than known fraud. When power later arrives, deception typically consolidates privilege. Instead, the entry into Mecca ends in forgiveness rather than revenge. None of this is final proof. But taken together, these elements form a pattern inconsistent with classic deception for personal gain. This test does not say he could not lie. It says that if this was a lie, it was among the strangest and least profitable deceptions in history. Here, the analysis pauses on the man. Now comes the most neutral test of all, separating the man from the text. So far, the investigation has focused on human explanations. Now, AI shifts perspective and examines the Qur'an itself. If it were a human product, traces of human authorship would be expected. Yet, several features diverge from typical human patterns. The Qur'an's style differs sharply from reported speech, as if consistently emerging from a different register. Its message remains stable across 23 years, even through unpredictable circumstances. At times, the text corrects the messenger, an unusual trait for self-authored authority. And transmission? A fluid human project would show greater variation. Instead, differences remain limited to recitation details, while the core text remains intact. This is not a verdict, but it raises a precise question. If the Qur'an is human, by what human mechanism did it arise without leaving clear traces? And now comes the final test, reversing the direction of analysis. Each theory explains only part of the picture. None explains the whole. When individual explanations fail, AI looks for patterns. And here, something difficult to ignore emerges. These theories do not complement one another. They contradict each other. One claims Muhammad was a genius. Another denies that, suggesting confusion instead. A third argues he copied from others. A fourth responds that he did not copy, but was taught. A fifth rejects any teacher altogether, claiming the community invented everything after him. This is not a coherent narrative. It is a sequence of collapsing attempts. And this leads to an unexpected conclusion, not about the Qur'an, but about the theories themselves. Across history, there has been a persistent effort to explain the Qur'an through any human pathway, except the one it claims for itself. That is not proof, it is a pattern. So the final question is no longer, what kind of man was Muhammad? But the question becomes simpler and harder. If all human explanations fail in different ways, is it because the origin of the Quran is complex, or because it is simpler than we expected? AI does not choose the answer. AI only measures. You have seen the motives, psychology, history, text, and transmission. And now only one question remains. Could Muhammad have fabricated this, even if he wanted to? Or does the only explanation that fills every gap happen to be the one the Quran claims for itself? That it did not come from a human, but from God?